Within 12 months, Drake was joined by a forest of over 75 drilling rigs that popped up around his Titusville site. By 1861, around 1 million barrels were being produced a year, far more than anyone knew what to do with. Oil Creek became a frenzied oil grab, and nowhere typified this chaos more than in the town of Pithole. I've come to meet local historian Brian Black to find out more about this apocryphal tale.
What you do to tell the story of a community is you go through U.S. Census records. And one of the things that sums up Pithole is it never appears in the U.S. Census because the decennial census happens every 10 years. And so 1860, it didn't exist, certainly. 1865, its oil begins to come in. And then by 1870, no one's here anymore.
So it's a flash in the pan.
Exactly. And so over a 6-month period, you had a town, a very prosperous town, develop just out of nowhere, literally. You'd have 10 hotels. You'd have enough saloons to support them. And essentially, you were bringing buildings up from the ground as quickly as you could and opening them immediately.
But for all that initial kind of planning, it sounds like once it started to take off, it was pretty chaotic.
Absolutely chaotic, and there was very little law. There was very little control over anything, and no one really cared about controlling it because really what mattered was the oil. So that's what leads to the boom. That's what leads people to rush.
So was Pithole a victim of its own success?
I think it was. It's crazy to think of today that we were sloppy with oil, but they had a bunch of it, and it was the only place it was coming from, and they simply didn't have the technology to control it.
The only problem we did have was a geological one. While the world was falling in love with this new fuel, nobody knew how much of it there was, or where exactly you could find some more.
Rockefeller may have brought light to America and in the process taken control of the oil industry, but to be honest, it wasn't worth controlling if there was no oil to sell.
He thought that he'd cracked that problem of supply when geologists drilling through the limestone rocks of Ohio uncovered what was at the time the world's biggest reserves of crude oil. In typically aggressive style, Standard moved in and bought the lot.
Eventually, Rockefeller had amassed something like 10 million barrels of Lima oil, an act that almost bankrupted the company. Mind you, he had secured the world's oil future. Or had he? It turns out there was a problem with Rockefeller's new oil. From BBC television, we're doing a series about oil.
Okay.
And this stuff, 100 years ago, they used to light their homes with. Never took on. I'm just wondering, what do you think? What do you...
Woo! Smells like a stink bomb. Oh. Oh.
What's wrong?
Stink.
Nice? Not nice? You like?
Damn, smell like shit, yeah.
Have a smell.
Ew.
Have a smell.
Ew, that's disgusting. Get away.
No, what's wrong with my oil? The Lima wells produced something that was called skunk oil because it absolutely stank. I mean, this stuff smells like something's crawled in there and died. And that rich aroma is a noxious cocktail of crude oil and sulfur. And the thing is, see, when you burn this stuff, it smells even worse. And that's the point. No one wanted to light their homes with something that smelled of skunk. And yet Rockefeller had just bought an ocean of the stuff.
His solution? Throw money at the problem. Rockefeller paid some of the world's finest chemists to work out a way of removing the oil's sulphurous odour. It was a close call, but it worked. but none of it could stop the Great War being the tragedy that it was. People power, not oil, was still at the heart of frontline conflict.
When I think of the Great War, I think of trench warfare and that colossal human carnage that places like this just bring home to you. But one of the most defining moments of the conflict wasn't dictated by the gun, but by gasoline. Outside of France, the incident is hardly known, but here it's referred to as the Taxi Armada. And the key to it was the speed of oil.
It's an event that took place within a month of the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. Paris was already on the verge of being taken by the Kaiser as German forces amassed just a few miles from the city limits. The fall was imminent.
While most people, including the entire French government, had already fled Paris, the city's military general, the rather eccentric Joseph Gallieni, was less keen to see it abandoned. For him, if Paris fell, the war was lost. The Germans had to be stopped.
The French made a desperate attempt to save the city, but found themselves heavily outnumbered on the front line. Gallieni needed reinforcements, but all his backup troops were 30 miles away in Paris.
Story goes that General Gallieni was standing on the street near Les Invalides when he saw a taxi go by. And then he saw another one, and another. And it suddenly dawned on him, what if he took these new gasoline-powered cars and used them to take his troops to the front?
And so the call went out to all Parisian cabs to abandon their passengers and assemble at the Boulevard des Invalides. I'm catching a cab ride with historian Laurent Henninger to find out what happened next.
So tell me, how did the Taxi Armada unfold?
Well, the 600 taxis were gathered here on that very Esplanade des Invalides where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
And they gather the troops,
Right.
and with 5 troopers per taxi.
So was it a turning point, if not in the war, but in the way that motor vehicles were used in war?
Yes, because it was probably one of the first examples, historical examples, of the extensive use of cars
Right.
in transporting troops in a war. And it was the beginning of a big historical trend that was the motorization of warfare.
Right. So it wasn't just symbolic; it was actually a game changer in the sense of the way it was done.
Of course, it was a huge game changer. And there's a funny little anecdote that while the taxis were ferrying the troops, their meters were running.
So they were still charging.
Yes.
That's brilliant.
Gallieni's Taxi Armada supplied over 6,000 troops to the front within 24 hours. With the French line strengthened, the Arabia and much of the Middle East flexed their muscles and took control of their own oil destiny. Next time, we look at how the most powerful oil superpower the world has ever known came to dominate.
The era of a very cheap source of energy is gone, and this is a new era.
And how its rise would bring the rest of the world to its knees.
The sudden cutoff of oil from the Middle East has turned the serious energy shortages we expected this winter into a major energy crisis.
All 3 episodes of BBC Radio